From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Let me say tonight that this victory here is the beginning of the end for Donald Trump.
Senator Bernie Sanders wins the New Hampshire primary a week after he won the popular vote in Iowa. We'll get the latest on the results, then speak with the legendary African-American feminist scholar Barbara Smith, who helped coin the term identity politics. She's supporting Bernie Sanders.
In him, I see the issues, the compassion, the perspective, the plans that will help us to get to where we need to be as a society.
Plus, we speak to the journalist who unearthed audio of billionaire presidential candidate Mike Bloomberg defending stop and frisk in stark racial terms. In the tape, the former New York mayor falsely claims 95% of murderers fit one description as he defends the targeting of young black and brown youth. And we talk to a member of the South Bend City Council about Pete Buttigieg's treatment of black community during his time as mayor. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont has won the New Hampshire primary a week after he won the popular vote in Iowa. With 87% of precincts reporting, Sanders has 25.7% of the vote, narrowly beating former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who's at 24.4%. Senator Amy Klobuchar placed third with nearly 20% of the vote. Both Senator Elizabeth Warren and former Vice President Joe Biden received under 10% of the vote after seeing their support plummet in recent weeks and months. Meanwhile, entrepreneur Andrew Yang has dropped out of the presidential race. The political newcomer made the announcement as New Hampshire's primary results rolled in, where he got 2.8% of the vote. Yang is the son of Taiwanese immigrants and one of only a few Asian Americans to mount a serious presidential run throughout U.S. history. He built his campaign primarily around a signature policy proposal, universal basic income. On Tuesday night, Colorado Senator Michael Bennet also dropped out of the presidential race after receiving only 905 votes in New Hampshire. We'll have more on the New Hampshire primary after headlines. In a highly unusual move, 4 federal prosecutors overseeing the criminal case against Trump's longtime friend and former campaign advisor Roger Stone have withdrawn from the case. One resigned from his job entirely after senior Justice Department officials demanded Stone receive a shorter prison sentence. A senior Justice Department official told CNN the 4 prosecutors all appeared to withdraw in protest of the intervention by top Justice Department officials, which came after President Trump went on a late-night Twitter rampage attacking federal prosecutors and saying the initial recommended sentence of between 7 and 9 years was a miscarriage of justice, even though the sentence range was based on federal sentencing guidelines. Only hours after Trump's tweets, a senior Justice Department official said the department was shocked by the sentence recommendations and would review it. Last November, Stone was convicted of 7 counts, including lying to Congress and tampering with a witness to prevent investigators from obtaining evidence on how the 2016 Trump campaign tried to benefit from stolen Democratic Party emails. Roger Stone could have faced up to 50 years in prison. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas forcefully rejected President Trump's Middle East plan during a speech to the UN Security Council Tuesday.
This plan will not bring peace or stability to the region, and therefore we will not accept this plan. We will confront its application on the ground. This is a summary of the project that was presented to us. This is the state that they will give us. It's like a Swiss cheese, really. Who among you will accept a similar state and similar conditions?
President Mahmoud Abbas's UN speech comes as Israeli troops violently crack down on Palestinian protests against Trump's Middle East plan, under which Israel would gain sovereignty over large areas of the occupied West Bank, Jerusalem would be under total Israeli control, and all Jewish settlers in the occupied territory would be allowed to remain in their homes. Israeli troops have killed 4 Palestinians last week in the crackdown against the protests. In Afghanistan, President Trump has conditionally approved a peace deal with the Taliban, potentially marking the beginning of the end of the longest war in U.S. history. Under the deal, the United States would gradually begin to withdraw U.S. troops if the Taliban reduces violence during a so-called test period later this month. The deal would also trigger negotiations between the Taliban and Afghan officials. The potential peace deal comes as a first-of-its-kind report from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction reveals thousands of people have been killed or wounded during the reconstruction process. The majority of the victims were Afghan civilians. The World Health Organization is warning the coronavirus poses a grave threat to the world as the death toll in China tops 1,100 people with more than 44,000 confirmed infections worldwide.
With 99% of cases in China, this remains very much an emergency for that country, but one that holds a very grave threat for the rest of the world, unless we use the window of opportunity that we have now.
Meanwhile, at least 174 people have now tested positive for coronavirus on the quarantine cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, which is docked off the coast of Japan. There are 3,600 people aboard the ship, where crew members say the workers aren't being protected from infection. Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaidó has returned to Venezuela, where protesters waited for him outside the airport Tuesday, screaming, "Dirty traitor," and "Get out." Guaidó was returning from a trip to the United States, where he attended President Trump's State of the Union address. Guaidó also traveled to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, during a political tour aimed at ousting Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Doctors Without Borders says more than two-thirds of migrants fleeing Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador left their home countries after a family member was murdered, disappeared, or kidnapped. The new study shows more than 40% of those interviewed said they fled after a family member was violently killed. In more immigration news, the Wall Street Journal reports Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and Customs Border Protection, or CBP, have spent over $1.2 million to access cell phone location data to track and arrest undocumented immigrants. The Homeland Security Department reportedly began purchasing cell phone location data in 2017 from a Virginia-based company called Ventel. The data is drawn from cell phone apps like games and weather apps that ask the user's permission to access their location. Sudan's longtime leader, Omar al-Bashir, will be handed over to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to face charges of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He's accused of leading the Sudanese government's scorched earth campaign in Darfur, where up to 300,000 people were killed and more than 2.5 million people were forced from their homes. Bashir was forced from power last April amidst massive anti-government protests in Sudan. A Manhattan federal judge has approved T-Mobile's plan to take over Sprint in a merger that would further consolidate the telecommunications industry by combining the nation's third and fourth largest wireless carriers. The ruling in favor of the merger came after attorneys general from 13 states and the District of Columbia tried to block it by arguing the consolidation would decrease competition in the industry and lead to higher cell phone bills. In Louisiana, a fire erupted in ExxonMobil refinery in Baton Rouge Tuesday night, sending plumes of black smoke into the air and turning the night sky orange. No injuries have been reported so far. ExxonMobil says it's monitoring air quality in and around the fire. And hundreds of graduate students at the University of California, Santa Cruz have gone on an open-ended strike to protest the unaffordable cost of living on their low teaching salaries. The strikers are demanding a cost of living adjustment of $1,412 per month, which student educators say is necessary to avoid living on the brink of homelessness as they teach classes and provide essential work to keep the university running. A 2018 study comparing housing costs with household incomes found Santa Cruz was the least affordable place to live in the United States. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont has won the New Hampshire primary a week after he won the popular vote in Iowa. With 87% of precincts reporting, Sanders has 25.7% of the vote, narrowly beating former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who is at 24.4%. Senator Amy Klobuchar placed third with nearly 20% of the vote. Both Senator Elizabeth Warren and former Vice President Joe Biden received under 10% of the vote after seeing their support plummet in recent weeks and months. On Tuesday, Biden canceled his election night party in New Hampshire and headed to South Carolina, which holds its primary on February 29th. President Trump easily won the Republican primary in New Hampshire. Former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld placed second with 9.2% of the vote. At a celebration in Manchester, New Hampshire, Bernie Sanders said his victory in New Hampshire is the beginning of the end for Donald Trump.
And the reason I believe we are going to win is that we have an unprecedented grassroots movement from coast to coast of millions of people. The reason that we are going to win is that we are putting together an unprecedented, multi-generational, multiracial political movement. And this is a movement from coast to coast, which is demanding that we finally have an economy and a government that works for all of us, not wealthy campaign contributors.
Pete Buttigieg addressed supporters in Nashua after placing second in New Hampshire.
And here in a state that goes by the motto, live free or die, you made up your own minds. You asserted that famous independent streak. And thanks to you, a campaign that some said shouldn't be here at all has shown that we are here to stay.
As the results of the New Hampshire primary came in, two more Democratic candidates dropped out. Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado and entrepreneur Andrew Yang, who campaigned for universal basic income. We go now to Manchester, New Hampshire, where we're joined by John Nichols of The Nation, where he's covering the race. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, John. So summarize what happened. Yes, at this point, the latest news, Bernie Sanders has won the New Hampshire primary.
That is correct, and it was a significant win. I know you'll hear a lot of punditry today that says that he didn't win by as much as he did in 2016. But the fact of the matter is that in an intense race where the lead moved among many candidates in the polls over the last several months, when all was said and done, Bernie Sanders prevailed. He prevailed because, again, as in Iowa, he had a significant, actually a huge victory among young voters. In towns like Durham, New Hampshire, and Keene, it was clear that their votes just really put him into a much stronger position. Sanders also did a surprisingly good job of mobilizing in some of the urban areas of the state, and I think that's something worthy of noting. With that said, there's also a caution here for Sanders, and there's a caution here for all the candidates. 63% of the voters in New Hampshire said that their top priority was to get a candidate who can beat Trump. Among those voters, there was a stronger support for Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar did very well. Among the 35% roughly of voters who said they want someone they agree with on the issues, Sanders did tremendously well. What Sanders has to do going forward is to deliver a message, and I think that I've interviewed him about this. I think he does understand this. He has to deliver a message that you can vote for the person you agree with and also beat Trump. It's that electability message, and the strength of the electability message is something that was illustrated by Amy Klobuchar's win, or strong showing. And Amy Klobuchar did very, very well in New Hampshire because she framed the entire close of her campaign around an electability argument. It brought her up so rapidly that at some points last night, there was speculation that she might even pull ahead of Pete Buttigieg. And so I think the takeaway from New Hampshire is, A, Sanders won. That's a big deal. It will get national attention and worthy of such. But B, going forward, all of these candidates clearly are going to have to make a very strong argument around electability, which is rooted not just in slogans and happy talk, but in really detailed arguments about what the polls show and what is possible.
Can you talk about, when people say, oh, yeah, it was easy for Bernie Sanders because he, is from next door. He's from Vermont. Of course, Elizabeth Warren is also from next door to New Hampshire, right? She's from Massachusetts. And her support really plummeted along with Biden. And we'll talk about that.
Yeah, that's true. Look, the neighboring state thing is of relevance. It shouldn't be denied. It does count for something. And in the counties and towns along the Vermont border, Bernie Sanders did very well. So we don't have to underestimate that. But as you point out, Elizabeth Warren, who actually comes from the state that has, in many ways, a larger influence in New Hampshire, didn't do that well. Remember, southern New Hampshire a lot of it's in the Boston media market and is very much touched by Massachusetts media, Massachusetts politics. And so Warren was seen to have a tremendous advantage. She also had a great level of organization and a great level of energy on the ground. She put a lot of time and money into the state, but it did not work. And for the Warren campaign, that becomes a real factor. I think a couple things need to be noted here. First off, she, I think, more than any other candidate, was hurt by the fact that she was in Washington focusing on impeachment. Now, Sanders was there as well, so was Klobuchar. But for Warren, that focus on impeachment took away from her time to really deliver that personal message that she's very, very good at doing at town halls and things like that. Sanders, on the other hand, did something really smart, and that was he relied heavily on surrogates who came into the state. If Bernie Sanders couldn't be present, someone prominent and well-known and, frankly, who could draw a crowd was working the towns and working the cities on his behalf. And so I do think that's a factor. And going forward, Warren says she wants to fight on, and I think she should. But going forward, the critical test now is if she can be physically present in these states, and that's particularly South Carolina and Nevada, can she begin to make those connections that bring her numbers up? She's really in a tough testing point here, but there are still possibilities for her.
And Joe Biden essentially giving up on New Hampshire and heading to South Carolina yesterday.
Well, I mean, with all due respect, he gave up on New Hampshire in the debate on Friday night. I have never, ever seen a candidate say, I took a hit in Iowa and I'm probably going to take a hit here. He essentially telegraphed in that Friday night debate, going into that incredibly critical final weekend, that he didn't expect to win. In fact, he didn't even expect to do very well. And so long before he flew out of state on primary day, which was, by the way, much noted in New Hampshire media, he had already telegraphed to voters that he didn't think he was going to do very well. Well, New Hampshire voters like to send a signal with their vote. And I believe that some of his comments Friday and even before led a lot of people to look much more seriously at Pete Buttigieg and at Amy Klobuchar. I think both of them benefited by Biden's, frankly, bumbling and politically inept performance. And I have to say one final thing. The way that Biden handled New Hampshire ought to send up every red flag and put off every alarm bell you can hear about the thought of him running against Donald Trump. I mean, he really did not do a good job in New Hampshire.
I should say that when we talked about Donald Trump winning the Republican primary, beating Bill Weld, some might have thought, what about the other person opposing him, Joe Walsh? He dropped out last week, the Illinois Congress member, saying, I would rather have a socialist in the White House than a dictator than a king than Donald Trump, indicating he would vote for Bernie Sanders if he were the Democratic candidate.
That is correct. And I was with Bill Weld yesterday. He was campaigning very hard. I talked to him. It's a very interesting thing that Bill Weld put a huge emphasis in his New Hampshire campaigning on his belief in science and his determination to address climate change. And that, I think, resonated with, look, almost 1 in 10 people who went and took a Republican ballot yesterday didn't vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Bill Weld. It's notable that about another 5% cast write-in votes or voted for other lesser-known candidates. So Donald Trump lost 15% of the Republican vote in New Hampshire. It's significant because I think there's this sense that there's an absolutely unified Republican enthusiasm for Trump. He has clearly put a lock on that party. But there are actually still, I think, a number of grassroots Republicans who are troubled by his presidency, and particularly troubled on issues. I'll circle back. Weld emphasized climate very, very much, and I think that resonated with a lot of kind of old-school New England Republicans.
One of the exit polls showed the concerns of people in New Hampshire. Number one, health care, number two, climate change, then inequality, and then foreign policy. John Nichols, I want to thank you for being with us, the nation's national affairs correspondent, host of the podcast Next Left. When we come back, we'll be joined by the legendary African-American feminist scholar Barbara Smith on why she supports Bernie Sanders as we head from the whitest states in the country where the first caucuses and primaries are held to the next ones, Nevada and South Carolina, where people of color make up a much larger percentage of the population. Stay with us. I Feel Love by Donna Summer. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at the presidential race following Bernie Sanders' victory in the New Hampshire primary, the race now moves to Nevada and South Carolina. We're joined by the legendary African-American feminist scholar Barbara Smith, founder of the Combahee River Collective and of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. Barbara Smith recently wrote a column in the Guardian newspaper headlined, "I help coin the term identity politics. I'm endorsing Bernie Sanders." Her latest book is Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. She's joining us from the capital of New York State, Albany. Barbara Smith, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. We are speaking
Great
to you.
To be with you, Amy. Thank you.
We're speaking to you on the day after the New Hampshire primary. After, actually, in the last 2 weeks, the first primary and caucus, Iowa and New Hampshire, that take place in two of the whitest states in the country. And now we move to states of far more diversity, Nevada and South Carolina, and then on to Super Tuesday. So you are now supporting Bernie Sanders. You're a surrogate for Senator Sanders. I was wondering if we could step back and you give us a little of your background. I was recently at the Combahee River in South Carolina after we did a environmental justice forum in Orangeburg, speaking with some of the presidential candidates, and made that trip to the Combahee River because it is so significant, Harriet Tubman, and all that she had accomplished. But talk about your background before you tell us why you support Senator Sanders.
Are we starting at birth, or are we going to fast forward?
Wherever you'd like to start.
Well, I think it's really important for people to know, and I say this in the article that was in The Guardian, it's important for people to know that I was born into Jim Crow. I was born in 1946, so Jim Crow was the law of the land during that time, during my growing up years. And the reason it's important, I think, is because it shaped very much who I was and my perspective on this project of U.S. democracy that we're still trying to improve. I've lived on the East Coast for many years. I teach and write, and probably more important than even those other things is that I've been involved in movements for social justice since the 1960s. I joined the civil rights movement as a teenager, and even though I lived in the North, the Congress of Racial Equality and other civil rights organizations were strong in Cleveland, and as I said, I got involved as a teenager, and from that day to this, I've been politically active and working for positive political social justice and change.
And the Combahee River Collective, what it is, what it was, its significance, and also you are credited with helping to coin the term identity politics and what that means.
Yes. The Combahee River Collective was a group of black feminists in Boston from the mid-1970s until around 1980. And we are best known. We were political activists. We've been involved in many movements, including the movement to end the war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, as I mentioned, the Panthers. We had a lot of movement experience, even though we were quite young at that time. It was always a small group, and I've always liked working in small grassroots groups. But what we're most known for is that we wrote a statement, the Combahee River Collective Statement, in 1977. It was actually for a book that was edited by the wonderful anti-racist and feminist scholar Zela Eisenstein. And the book was titled Capitalist Patriarchy in the Case for Socialist Feminism. So we wrote something for the book. That's what she asked us to do. And the something turned out to be the Combahee River Collective Statement, which seemingly has stood the test of time. And many people still read it, refer to it. And in fact, the Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives, those movements actually say that they have relied upon the kinds of ideas of black women's liberation that were in that statement. And indeed, the phrase identity politics is in the statement. I've spent quite a few years, decades actually, trying to find if indeed that phrase appears anywhere earlier than 1977. And I consult with friends who are scholars and researchers and deep readers, and no one has ever been able to show me or find that it was anywhere else prior to that. We're still searching. I think computers might help with that.
So talk today about why you've decided to support Bernie Sanders. The corporate media makes a great deal out of saying he doesn't have the support of African Americans, so important, and particularly African American women. You almost never see on CNN or MSNBC, I'm not talking about Fox here, a commentator who is, a outright supporter of Bernie Bernie Sanders. So talk about when you decided that he was your presidential candidate.
I decided in 2016. I supported him then, and I supported him before the campaign reached out to me in 2016 to see if I would be interested in being involved in, and I was, in an LGBTQ steering committee. So I was asked to take part, to be a part of that. And I also worked on women's issues. It was pretty late during the primary season, but I worked very hard, as I always do, and we did as much as we possibly could to bring in those constituencies. So as I said, I didn't just decide. I decided in 2016 before I even had any working contact with the campaign. And of course, I continue to support him during this 2020 election cycle. So
talk about what it is that he represents that you feel is most important and why you're willing to go out and campaign for him around the country.
The reason I support Bernie Sanders is because of the fact that he has a theory of change. You know, that's a popular phrase now. He has an understanding of, why things are not working in our U.S. Society, and he has ideas like Medicare and health care for all, like changing the criminal justice system, like having access to college for all young people and not just for those who are privileged. He has good ideas about how we can actually fulfill that promise that the founders supposedly put out in their very flawed way, since they didn't really include people like me. They didn't include women. They didn't include black people. But they had some great ideas about freedom and justice for all. He has the plans. He has the passion and the compassion. He has the base of support, which is much more diverse than I think any of the other candidates at this point. He just, we're just in sync. He and I are near the same age, and we were both involved in movements in our younger days as students. And we just, as I said, I've only met him once, so I don't know him. It's not like we're like buddies or anything like that. It doesn't come from that kind of contact. It comes from looking at what he is standing for, what he proposes to do, and what he has done, actually. I've been aware of him. Someone asked me, when did you first know about Bernie Sanders? I said, I feel like I've known about him at least all of his life and his political life, because I knew about him when he was a mayor in Burlington. So I have definitely followed him through the years.
In 2016, Bernie Sanders said identity politics distracts from what he considered real issues like economic inequality and the decline of organized labor. Has he changed his view of identity politics? I mean, you say you've only spoken with him once, but what are your thoughts about that?
I think he's obviously changed, and that's manifested in the kind of campaign that he's running. There's such a commitment to having a diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic, various religions. I mean, I love the coverage of the mosque where people voted in Iowa, and how 99% of the people there, many of whom were immigrants, how they voted and supported Bernie Sanders. But that took outreach from the campaign. That it did not just magically happen. I think that he has changed, and I also think that the term identity politics has been so distorted since we originally coined it. And I should say, Amy, I should tell you what we meant by it. What we meant in 1977 by identity politics is that black women have a right to determine our own political agendas, period. That's all that we meant. All the things that have been attached to the term identity politics in succeeding decades, that's not what we were talking about. And the reason that we said that back then is because of the fact that it was not thought that black women had any particular political issues or concerns that needed to be addressed and worked on. So there's a title of a book, you may have heard of it, it's my book. All the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And that was the perspective back then, that black politics and black liberation agendas were one size fit all for both black men and women. And it's not, of course, I mean, all black people have things in common and have realities in common and injustices in common that we need to address. And women also, regardless of race, have issues in common, like violence against women, for example, the access to reproductive freedom. But what we were saying is that there are things that we experience who are people who are both and simultaneously black and women, and also other identities, working class. Many of us were lesbians in the Combahee River Collective, so we were really looking at systems of oppression as they interlocked. And subsequently, Kim Crenshaw, the legal scholar, came up with the concept of intersectionality. But as I said, we weren't bad-mouthing or putting down anyone who wasn't our identical mirror image. That was not what we meant. We just said we have a right to shape our own political identity. Our own political agenda that comes out of our political identity. That's what we meant by identity politics.
Could you speak to young activists who work around issues of identity politics, and what advice would you give them, Barbara Smith?
Well, the first thing I would say is you got to work in coalition. You cannot be so, so immersed in your own particular experiences, your wonderful, multi-layered, complex experiences of your identity, you can't be so immersed in that you cannot look out at that person across the room, across the street, in another neighborhood, in another nation, around the globe. You cannot be so immersed in what you are experiencing that you cannot see that wider arc of a need to work for justice and do it in coalition and in solidarity with others. And I think that's what has been lost. I think that because identity politics and black feminism and some of the things that I have actually helped to establish in academic context, I think that sometimes when they're talked about in academic context, people don't understand that, no, what we're really talking about is positioning ourselves so that we can build a mass movement for positive political change and for justice. So when people think that the only people worth talking to are people who have the exact same list of identities that they have, I always say, why would I want to work with people who are just like me? That would be boring. So that would be my major advice, is take that risk. Take that risk of joining in coalitions, doing work on the ground where you live. Like if you live in a city, there's probably well, there are a lot of issues, but one of the issues might likely be gun violence. Another one might be poverty or poor housing. Another one might be schools that are not of sufficient quality so that everybody has great opportunities as they grow up and become adults and get into life. See what it would be like to walk into a school board meeting. Do you see what I'm saying? Maybe you do. Well, I bet you do, Amy. But it's just really so important that we stretch and that we work for justice across the board. And that doesn't mean that we can't be in our own, safe spaces and in our own kind of home kind of environment. We can do both. As Bernie Sanders now, if you can give him advice, as the senator coming off of a popular win in Iowa and an outright win in New Hampshire, at least with 87% of the figures in at this point, heading down now to South Carolina, the Nevada's first, and then the South Carolina primary. What advice do you have for him as he moves from the whitest states in the country to states with a majority people of color population? Well, I would not presume to give Senator Sanders advice. I really would not. I'm really happy to be a part of the campaign. I think that he is effective, and the campaign has been effective in attracting more diverse constituencies. I feel like, and I just said this to someone a few days ago, I feel like if Senator Sanders can get in front of the electorate, if he can connect with them and share his message and his ideas with them, I think they're going to be really taking a lot of notice. There are a lot of myths going on, well, always in this society about race and racism and who is who and what is what. And there's certainly there's a lot of chatter and a lot of talk about who can appeal to black voters in particular. And my feeling is, let's just watch us. Watch him. I think that they're doing a really good job of connecting with our incredibly beautiful, diverse United States, all the kinds of people who live here. And I just think that the more that happens, the more effective and the more he'll be known. And we'll just see what happens. Barbara Smith, I'm going to ask you to stay with us as we break and then move on to some other subjects that I think you'd be very interested in. And I also wanted to clarify, South Carolina is actually majority white, but 78% of South Carolina's Democrats are African American. More than 3/4 of the Democrats in South Carolina are black. Barbara Smith, author, activist, independent scholar, founder of the Combahee River Collective and of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. Her latest book, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. She'll stay with us, but when we come back, we're going to speak to the journalist who unearthed audio of billionaire presidential candidate Mike Bloomberg defending stop and frisk. And we look at Pete Buttigieg's record of over-policing the black community in South Bend, Indiana. Stay with us.
Yaphela phansi yaze yakhala izinyembezi nomathemba wangishiya sele ngedwa nomathemba wangishiya.
Ladysmith Black Mambazo, the South African a cappella group, the founder, Joseph Shabalala, died at the age of 78. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Bloomberg is racist. That's the hashtag that's trending on Twitter since audio of remarks made by the 2020 Democratic presidential hopeful, the former New York City mayor, Michael Bloomberg, surfaced earlier this week. In the clip from the 2015 Aspen Institute, Bloomberg is heard defending the New York City Police Department's controversial stop-and-frisk policies, saying, quote, 95% of murdered victims fit one MO. You can just take the description, Xerox it, pass it out to all the cops. Listen closely.
95% of your murderers and murdered victims fit one MO. You can just take the description, Xerox it, and pass it out to all the cops. They are male, minorities, 15 to 25. That's true in New York. It's true in virtually every city.
That's Mike Bloomberg saying, quote, they are male, minorities, 16 to 25. That's true in New York. That's true in virtually every city. He went on to say, quote, and the way you get the guns out of the kids' hands is to throw them up against the walls and frisk them. Bloomberg issued a statement Tuesday saying, quote, I inherited the police practice of stop and frisk, and as part of our effort to stop gun violence, it was overused. By the time I left office, I cut it back by 95%, but I should have done it faster and sooner. I regret that, and I have apologized. Unquote. But Bloomberg did not just inherit stop and frisk. During his tenure as mayor, the use of the practice increased sevenfold. During his time in office, the New York police recorded over 5 million stop and frisks. The vast majority of those stop were Black and Latino. As mayor of New York, Bloomberg long defended stop and frisk. This is Bloomberg speaking during a 2013 interview on WOR radio.
They just keep saying, oh, it's a disproportionate percentage of a particular ethnic group. That may be, but it's not a disproportionate percentage of those who witnesses and victims describe as committing the murder. In that case, incidentally, I think we disproportionately stop whites too much and minorities too little.
In fact, thousands of people marched against stop and frisk during his 3 terms in office. Bloomberg defended stop and frisk as recently as 2019, only apologizing for the practice publicly in November, shortly after entering the presidential race. Well, for more, we're going to Atlanta, Georgia, where we're joined by Benjamin Dixon, the host of The Benjamin Dixon Show and podcast. He unearthed and publicized the 2015 audio of Michael Bloomberg speaking at the Aspen Institute that we just played for you. Dixon is the co-founder of the NorthStar.com, the revitalized abolitionist newspaper of Frederick Douglass. It's great to have you with us. Benjamin Dixon, talk about, I mean, it's very clear that the Bloomberg campaign knew that this was going to drop. They knew there was this recording, however muffled, of his statements at the Aspen Institute from 2015, and they were ready with a statement. Talk about why you released this, how you found it, and what Bloomberg has said in response.
Yes, thanks for having me, Amy. It was online. It was hiding in plain sight. I've read several articles about this speech, and what drew my attention to it was the fact that they were looking, that Bloomberg's team actually requested that the video from the Aspen Institute not be released. The Aspen Institute acquiesced. They did not release the video, but I was hoping to be able to find at least an audio clip, and that's exactly what I found. It had been online for 5 years. I was able to isolate it, cut it up, and make it a little more audible, and I felt that it just carried a significant significant impact that the words in the article did not. I felt like people needed to hear his voice say these things.
And on Tuesday morning, President Trump tweeted, wow, Bloomberg is a total racist. This was in response to the video, the audio you released. Wow, Bloomberg is a total racist. Trump later deleted the post. Interestingly, while campaigning for president in 2016, Trump called for stop and frisk to be instituted nationwide.
Right. Right. Yeah, the level of hypocrisy that comes from the president isn't surprising, but that exemplifies the weakness that candidates like Michael Bloomberg will have against Donald Trump. His audience has no problem with the fact that he is a racist, but he will call someone else a racist. Michael Bloomberg has put himself in a position where he has a long-standing history of problems in New York City, particularly with stop and frisk. And so the president will stand on the debate stage and call him a racist when the rest of America knows that he's the white supremacist in chief.
Now, in 2015, Michael Bloomberg representatives asked the Aspen Institute not to distribute footage of his interview. Is that right, Ben?
That's correct. According to the Aspen Times, which was the article that put me on the search for this audio or for the video, it was the article that showed that his team knew that there was something wrong with what he said. They did not want that video released because I feel like video would have been even more compelling than the audio. And so they understood the magnitude of what he said in 2015. And now they're doing their best to control the damage now that it has been released.
Can you talk about the response to you releasing this? How viral has it gone, and what has been the response to you?
Well, the response has been overwhelmingly shocked because there's something about hearing his words. Like, everyone knew his record with stop and frisk in New York City, but it was something different when people were able to hear it. And because of that, the video that I put together with the transcript or with the subtitles, it's now at 7.4 million views, which has more views than his announcement, than Michael Bloomberg's announcement video on Twitter. And so I just think a lot of people are appreciative, and I'm grateful to have been able to do this because a lot of us feel like it's a David versus Goliath situation with a person with billions of dollars to spend in this campaign, able to flood the internet with advertisements, television with advertisements, portraying himself in a way that a lot of people in New York City would disagree with.
I want to turn to CNN. The politics correspondent Christina Lessie commenting on the 2015 audio of Bloomberg unearthed by you, Ben.
So here's the thing. Important context here. We don't have the full tape. So this is obviously snippets that have been released. The podcaster and the writer that released this sound is clearly a Bernie supporter. If you look at his Twitter feed, he's very anti-Bloomberg. He is promoting a hashtag, Bloomberg is a racist. We don't know how he got the sound to begin with. So lots of questions are being asked, especially on the timing of this. As you noted in your introduction, a poll yesterday shows Bloomberg rising in the polls and particularly strong support in the African-American community.
So that's CNN's Christina Lessie, who did not disclose that she's a former Bloomberg News reporter. Benjamin Dixon, if you can respond to what she said.
Yeah, this is the tactic that they're using to try to insulate Mayor Bloomberg from his own words, right? There are questions, and the questions is, does he still stand by what he said in 2015? Because if you look at his apology, the apology that he gave just before running for president, it does not match the intensity of his words in 2015. What he said in 2015 is a deeply held conviction about black and brown young men in the city of New York. What he gave us in terms of an apology is really milquetoast, and it doesn't match up the thoughtfulness that he's placed in his worldview. And so he sent out, I don't know if he sent out Christina, but she was part of his organization. But apparently there's other people who are going out trying to cast doubt on my motivations and my intentions and say that there are a lot of questions. Well, the questions aren't about where this came from. It was online, and some simple, basic journalistic research would have revealed it. And so the real question is, where does he stand today? His apology really pointed towards Donald Trump, not towards taking his own personal responsibility for what he said. So the real question is, where does Michael Bloomberg stand on this today? Where does he stand on the words that he said and the actions that he took that harmed so many people in the city of New York?
And your response to those who say you're just trying to take down Bloomberg because you support Bernie Sanders?
So I'm Johnny-come-lately with my support for Bernie Sanders. I supported him in 2016. I took my time deciding whether or not I would support him this time because, honestly, I'd liked Elizabeth Warren. But, yes, I do support Bernie Sanders, and that's my right as a citizen. That has nothing to do with the fact that no matter who gets the nomination, I don't believe it should be a billionaire oligarch who is able to buy his way into this campaign, who has a history of racism, transphobia, as well as classism. Mike Bloomberg has a lot to answer for, and he's not going to get away with it simply by asking or declaring that I'm a Bernie bro, and so my opinion doesn't matter. It doesn't work like that.
Benjamin Dixon, I want to thank you for joining us, host of the Benjamin Dixon Show and podcast, speaking to us from Atlanta, Georgia. As we turn now to look at other police policies in other parts of the country, to look at Pete Buttigieg's record on policing and racial justice following his second-place finish in New Hampshire last night. The former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, has surprised many with his strong showings in Iowa and New Hampshire, two of the country's whitest states. But as the race moves on now to Nevada and South Carolina, Buttigieg continues to poll extremely low with African-American voters. His own former constituents are condemning his treatment of the black community in South Bend during his time as mayor, calling out systemic racism in the police force. During Buttigieg's tenure as mayor from 2012 to 18, black residents were 4.3 times more likely to be arrested for possessing marijuana than white people. At last week's presidential debate, ABC News moderator Lindsay Davis questioned Pete Buttigieg about the rise in arrests of black people under his administration.
Well, the reality is, on my watch, drug arrests in South Bend were lower than the national average. The overall rate was lower.
No, there was an increase. The year before you were in office, it was lower. Once you became in office in 2012, that number went up. In 2018, the last year that we have a record for, that number was still up.
Yeah. And one of the strategies that our community adopted was to target when there were cases where there was gun violence and gang violence, which was slaughtering so many in our community.
Well, for more, we go to Chicago, where we're joined by Henry Davis, Jr., a South Bend City Council member since 2008. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Henry Davis, Jr. Can you talk about your experience as a City Council member with your mayor at the time? He just recently stepped down, Pete Buttigieg, who's now just placed second in the New Hampshire primary.
Well, thank you for having me. My time working with Mayor Buttigieg was, at best, it was contentious. It was very difficult to get across to him and also to his administration how African Americans were living in South Bend and in some of the issues that confronted them on a daily basis. You're talking about double-digit unemployment. You're talking about a very high poverty rate, over 40%. You're talking about high crime. You're talking about schools shutting down and closing. And even some of his policies, when it came to 1,000 houses, 1,000 days program, when he decided to go through the hood or, in the black and brown areas, and he wanted to demolish those homes. And the homes were demolished, but it wasn't the fact that some of those homes didn't need to come down. It was the fact that there was no affordable housing program that came behind it. And so now we're still dealing with, empty lots, high weeds, and a lot of varmints that are living in those empty lots. And so you're talking about right now, even with the police force, you have the lowest number serving of African-American officers in the police force in South Bend. So, there are a number of issues that confronted the African-American community and that he really chose not to deal with. And so as a councilman and having a predominantly black district, a lot of those, fights were held and had on the council floor. And I did as much as I could to satisfy the residents and the constituencies. But it was very hard going back and forth and not getting that money invested back into the community like it should have been. And so here we are now, dealing with a presidential idea of a Pete Buttigieg, and even back in South Bend, how do we correct some of these social ills in its environment? African Americans. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I wanted to say the whole country learned about the murder of Eric Logan, a black South Bend resident who was shot and killed by white police officer Ryan O'Neal because, of course, at the time, Mayor Pete Buttigieg was running for president. Can you talk about how he handled that and also about the firing of the first black police chief, Darrell Boykins?
Well, just like I just talked about, he didn't handle it. And if he did handle it, it was a fumble. Eric Logan was a combination of events that took place since he took office back in 2012. Right after he took office, there was a young man by the name of Michael Anderson that ended up dying under suspicious circumstances with the South Bend Police Department. There was another young man named Deshaun Franklin who happened to be sleeping in his home, and he was attacked and brutally beaten up by South Bend Police. And, you know, none of those officers were even disciplined. Then you had Eric Logan, and a lot of things happened in between there as well. But then you have Eric Logan who died, you know, at the end of a gun, you know. And so we, you know, it just has not been a good ride. South Bend needs a do-over. And this is like, you know, the things that has happened right now with the Democratic Party as a whole. You know, blacks, African Americans is the backbone of the Democratic Party. And we desire good schools. We desire safe neighborhoods. We desire good jobs. We desire the same thing that most people desire and need and want to live in America. And if we're planning on beating a Donald Trump, you know, this coming November, we have to have an organized and unified attack that's going to make sure that there's a candidate out in front that's going to be interested in making sure that we not only vote, but those things that we're voting for are going to happen. And right now, you have a slate of candidates. They're everywhere. They're not talking about the hardcore issues that you would talk about at your kitchen table, at your local diner, or even at church. They're not talking about those things. They're talking about just a lot of different wild ideas on how this is supposed to work. This is not a student council race. This is for the presidency of the United States of America. This is the rule of the free world. And African Americans are Americans. And we desire to have our priorities as a part of someone's platform.
I wanted to bring Barbara Smith, the feminist scholar, back into this conversation. And as you're listening to these two examples, looking at Bloomberg, looking at Buttigieg, your thoughts?
High, aren't they? I think that they always say this is the most important election of our lifetime. But given what's in the White House at this point, and given what's going on in our nation, we really have to be very, very alert, and we really need to look at the candidates and figure out which one of them is capable. And obviously, the things that were just discussed about two of the candidates, as far as I'm concerned, that makes them unelectable, because another racist in the White House, that's just like a little too much to bear. I think that we do have a candidate who deals with bread and butter issues, and that's why I'm supporting Bernie Sanders.
Henry Davis Jr., if you could talk about, I mean, I guess the population of South Bend is something like, it's more than a quarter African American. In the last minute that we have you been surprised at the rise of your former mayor, of Pete Buttigieg, from South Bend mayor and all the controversies that were there at the time, to now being one of the front runners for president in the United States?
I'm absolutely surprised by the rise. There's an expectation of presidential, but there's also something that needs to go behind that and something to support it, and that means a resume and some real-life things that have occurred. Biden took a text out on Mayor Pete, you know, recently this past week, and talked about his lack of experience. And although those things probably were pretty hardcore, the truth is that we expect that we're going to have a president that has some support from the rest of the U.S. Senate, some support from the rest of the U.S. Congress, but not only that, but have some real-life experience at trying to be or being a president or being something that is more than a mayor. And so we desire somebody there that is going to be able to, day one, take over the reins and try to correct some of the things that Donald Trump has, you know, stepped on and hurt us with.
We're going to have to leave it there. Henry Davis Jr., thank you so much, as well as Barbara Smith. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.